I'm going to suggest to you a Hayekian solution to a wicked problem. But first, I need to tell you a story. In 1892, 18-year-old Amber Murray placed an advertisement in the Sydney Morning Herald for a kind person to take charge of her baby son, Horace. Horace was illegitimate, and Amber had spent 3 months unable to judge work and baby. The advertisement drew the attention of John and Sarah Macon. They seemed kindly, and in return for an upfront payment of £3 and ongoing payments of 10 shillings a week, offered to care for Horace while still allowing Amber to visit him. Over the following weeks and months, Amber kept trying to see Horace, only to be rebuffed with excuses. Eventually, she arrived to find that the Macons had disappeared. In October of the same year, council worker James Hanoni was clearing a blocked drain when he discovered the bodies of 2 infants. The Macons had moved again, but by now the resources of the New South Wales police were directed to investigating every house in which they had ever lived. The police found 12 dead bodies in addition to Horace's, which Amber identified from his clothing. The Macons were baby farmers, a descriptor of sufficient vintage to be foreign to most people now. Baby farmers relied on the stigma of illegitimacy and laws that mandated that men did not have to provide for children born out of wedlock, to take in infants and very frequently kill them. Because the sums of money the single women provided were of necessity small, it was better to kill the baby sooner, because that was more profitable. The Macon case, a true cause célèbre, made its way to the House of Lords, which in Australia sat at the time as the Privy Council. It was at the time Australia's highest appellate court. Trial evidence disclosed that the Macons turned to baby farming after John, a brewery drayman, had been injured at work and was unable to walk. Meanwhile, Sarah had once been a midwife and was not unkind. Indeed, when the court imposed sentence, her daughters pleaded for clemency and her capital conviction was commuted to life imprisonment. John, however, was hanged in 1893, and at trial level, these are the sentencing remarks from Justice Matthew Henry Stephen. What, as much as anything, those remarks indicate is something that anybody who is my Facebook friend sees very regularly, and something that I emphasise a great deal, and something that is also taught by the practice and study of the law. The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there, very differently. And all of our modern conceptions of the way we view children are inventions entirely of the last 100 years. Everything previous to that would look completely unrecognisable to most of us. Baby farming was a characteristic of the 19th century. And in response to it, the state said, this is a failure, too many people are dying. It was absolutely catastrophic, the numbers of children who died as a result of baby farmers. And so the state response, and the response also of the charitable sector, was institutions. And they also failed. First, the charitable sector. You should be familiar with those 2 particular stories from Ireland. I choose Irish stories because my mother came from the Republic. So I tend to have some affinity with the stories that come from there. And no, it's quite true in the context that those particular stains are probably never likely to wash out. However, while we're busily kicking the Catholic Church and every other kind of charitable institution that also had these awful social problems, here's the state. Now, I spent my girlhood in Australia and in Queensland, the state with the largest Aboriginal population. You might notice that many of the children in this photograph are quite pale-skinned because the policy of Aboriginal child removal engaged in by the government was directed at what was known colloquially as half-caste children. That is, those typically with a white father and a black mother, although often, and some of the darker ones you'll see there, there will be an Asian father present, perhaps a Japanese pearl diver or someone from what is now modern-day India. Before these institutional failures, if we step back in time again to the past and find its foreignness, we have the best available statistical data collected by paediatrician Larry Milner in the United States, is that 25% of all children were routinely killed. This is children under the age of 1. This is in addition to the 25% of children under the age of 1 to 3, depending on how hygienic the civilization in question was, that died from diseases that are now prevented by vaccines. Horst Rittel first conceptualised wicked problems in the context of management, and I've always particularly liked that comment because we like to think of something like this, it must be evil, but actually it's not evil, it's just hard. And in context, the wicked problem here, to which I think Hayek has come up with at least a partial improvement, there are no solutions to wicked problems, works like this. Providing adequate care for unwanted children and the women who bear them is a wicked problem, incapable of complete solution. We can improve it, but fixing it is out of the question. Wicked problems are difficult or impossible to solve, typically for 4 reasons, and these are the 4 original reasons that Rittel wrote about in his paper. There has been a lot of academic work since on wicked problems, and this is a gross oversimplification for which I apologise. We confront incomplete or contradictory knowledge. Why do women have children? A vast number of people and opinions involved. Every unmarried mother, those who set welfare policy, children raised in single-parent households. This is an extraordinarily large number of people. We are confronted by a large economic burden because of both charitable and state failure, and before that infanticide and baby farming. We have made a collective decision that we will have some form of welfare state in order to help solve this particular wicked problem. But then, of course, and welfare is expensive, I mean, as libertarians are constantly pointing out. But this is an interconnected problem. It's connected with lots of other problems. We have a serious problem of demographic decline. There are not enough children being born to grow up to be taxpayers, to pay the pensions of those who are now growing old. And in China, there are not enough children being born to care for those who are growing old, even though China does not have to think about the idea of a pension system because it doesn't have one. Much ink has been spilt over the years about the deleterious effect of the welfare state on the family. That all may be true, it all may be false. Daniel Patrick Moynihan is the most famous. However, every single person who writes like that on this issue makes the grave, grave error of forgetting that the past is a foreign country and they do things differently there. So, when we come to improve our wicked problem, this is what we are confronted with. And of course, you can see the immediate application of Mr. Hayek. We don't know so many of the answers to the questions. We know so very little. But the problem is our state institutions don't know the answers, our private sector charitable institutions don't know the answers, and because of the religious doctrine, particularly of Catholicism, of the monotheisms, we have quite literally many of those who seek to solve the problem, i.e. in the charitable sector, are also responsible for it. They make the problem worse. And then, of course, we're discounting the future because there aren't enough of us long-term to pay the bills. However, we lucky people have had on our side, as Winston Churchill once said, in reference in this case to the fight against radical Islam, we have been embraced by the secure arms of science. And science has ameliorated a great part of the wicked problem by providing control over a great bulk of fertility, although by no means all. And we have always had, but it once again depends on the civilizational values of the society in question, what my tutor, who taught me Roman law, used to use this expression, the preferred alternative to infanticide. You will occasionally see in some extremely sexist civilizations infanticide being legal, but abortion being illegal. Classical Athens was like that. And the reason was because abortion, of course, was the woman's choice. In Roman law, abortion was always preferred because they worked on the idea that it meant that the mother didn't have to go through childbirth. And recent research by specialists in obstetrics indicate that an extinct compound known as silphium, which is related to phenol, meant that Roman abortionists were pretty efficient. And you didn't have the maternal mortality rate that you associate with unsafe abortion in the developing world. Science and welfare combined have done this. I could only go back to I could only get 1995 data to put into a pretty graph, and I'm sorry, I'm a lawyer, so I don't have this sort of talent. Whereas once homicide, and this is for the United States, would have been at the same end as congenital anomalies, it is now down here as something ridiculous. It has become a legal curiosity. However, it is important to remember, in the context of legal history, that it has always been difficult to secure convictions for infanticide. And indeed, it is called infanticide because the law was changed in 1922 because juries simply wouldn't wear it being called murder, and nobody was ever convicted. So this is where Professor Hayek's solution is a particularly good one in combination with science. It is pretty clear from all the available evidence that biological parents do a better job of raising their children than either the state or the charitable sector, who are both pretty terrible. It's also pretty clear that women know when they are capable of caring for a child. And I shall put my final little argument in for a negative income tax or guaranteed basic income. We now know, when it comes to foreign aid, that if you just turn up and give people money, it's actually far more effective than income management or tide aid, or you have to buy Caterpillar tractors, or the various other silly things that we do when it comes to foreign aid that supposedly improves the balance of payments but doesn't really. It's a big joke. And the reason why this is much cheaper and much less nasty than lots and lots of the other things that we've got is that there are no perverse incentives built into it, as there is in the current welfare system, to have more children. It's a simple matter of a fixed sum of money, and so it operates on people in exactly the same way. And I shall conclude then with a quotation, in this case from Law, Legislation and Liberty, where Hayek made the following observation. There is no reason why, in a free society, government should not assure to all protection against severe deprivation in the form of an assured minimum income, or a floor below which nobody need descend. To enter into such an insurance against extreme misfortune may well be in the interest of all. In this case, I say it is in the interests of all because of the very great danger attaching to us wealthy, modern people of forgetting that the past is indeed a foreign country.
Thank you. Thank you very much for a very provocative and interesting paper, very thought-provoking and thoughtful. It's appropriate that we're having a wicked problems discussion on Friday the 13th. And my wife thought it was very interesting when I asked her about these baby farms. It's a kind of alarming look into a past that is, like you said, a foreign land. The paper is very interesting for a variety of reasons. When you look at the arguments and you look at the history that you're discussing, there are many Hayekian aspects to it. As you note, there's a degree of complexity here. There are complex social processes that are not confined strictly to the economic sphere. They spill over or influence substantially in the political sphere, the social sphere, the religious sphere. And these are all things that Hayek considered very important. As we all know, he worked in economics, he worked in law, he worked in understanding social processes and looking at very foreign lands. Your paper strikes me as actually also being somewhat consistent with his ideas on the fatal conceit. He has this great doubt for people's ability to solve problems, or at least their overestimation of their ability to solve problems. And what you've identified in the case of baby farmers is a situation, according to your argument, where easy solutions or even feasible solutions don't come very easily. I think that's an important lesson, that we so frequently assume that we can do something, when very often I think we need to stop and ask, just what likelihood is there that we can deliver the means to accomplish some ends, and especially in social policy. In reading your paper, I was struck by a small but growing literature that looks at perverse spontaneous orders. So we often think of spontaneous orders as leading to good outcomes, say in a market where property rights are well defined and the rule of law exists. But there are many situations where people act not in coordination or some specific end, but this leads to very bad situations. It could be riots, it could be criminal groups interacting in arenas that lead to situations where society is worse off, or maybe even all the people involved are worse off. So maybe the Titanic or something like that. So I see your papers fitting very in, I guess, theoretically and content-wise with much of the Hayekian literature. Very beneficial to read for that. I thought that there were a few interesting aspects that I'd like to hear kind of elaborated on. Obviously, constraints in how long the article could be. But I'd be delighted to learn a bit more about your thoughts on a few issues. One is, if I understand the argument correctly, it's that the social safety net was the solution to baby farming, combined with technological advance. And the Hayekian solution, as you say, was the only one that could solve it. And I wonder if those claims are too strong for two reasons. One is just to say that this is the only way that you could solve the problem may lack some of the creativity, the uncertainty that Hayek's work also characterizes or often suggests. There's many more opportunities for social institutions to form the way they look, the outcomes that they pursue, than we might immediately think. The second is kind of identifying what is the causal factor. You note, of course, that there is substantial economic development between that time and this time, between the foreign land and our homeland. What extent was this important? Why wasn't just a general improvement in the standard of living the causal factor? How can we think or suspect that it was some social safety net? I was a little struck by the argument that it was a Hayekian solution, and that is perhaps the least original of everything that Hayek has, is the idea that there should be some basic income. And so I wonder if, maybe in a revised version of the paper, if you'd want to, I could see a lot of other areas where you could leverage Hayek even more. So his focus on institutions and understanding how institutions operate, how they differ across different spheres of society, how within a set of rules of the game, outcomes do better or do worse. I wonder if you might reframe your argument as more of Hayek motivates the problem by showing us the complexity of social outcomes, and anyone who's offered for a social safety net provides one possible explanation for how to solve that problem. I'd be very curious to hear a bit more about the failures, and what is the nature of these failures? They're equal failures according to your paper, the state and charitable organizations. On what criteria should we judge these things? Reducing the number of dead babies? Is it reducing the purchase of babies? So one way to talk about the problem would be to ask, how representative is the disturbing people that you put on the screen at the beginning? Markets occasionally fail, people commit crimes, bad things happen. But might a market for babies actually be an excellent situation? A situation where these kids are taken care of instead of left to starve or die. And as you well know, there's kind of a long history of this happening, and to many people's satisfaction. So is the criteria of success based on reducing child sales, reducing child deaths, economic well-being and development? What is the goal that we're trying to, what's the criteria through which you're judging these institutions? And then from a comparative institution, is it really true that they're equal failures? Do they fail in the same way? Do they have the same weaknesses? Are they sensitive to the same types of changes and shocks? Are states or charitable organizations more sensitive to religious influence, for example? Are they more resistant to political cronyism? So I think you could really pull out a lot of the rich institutional detail and frame this problem from a very comparative institutional perspective. That would be just remarkable, very fascinating to hear the details on at greater length.
Well, thanks very much, Sam, and it's really great to be addressing this symposium. It's an honour and it's a pleasure. My topic is on how Hayek would deal with gendered violence. Sexual violence and the problem of sexual violence is not something that one immediately comes to mind when one thinks about Hayekian political economy. But I think there are three very good reasons for trying to use Hayek to address this topic. The first is that, gender and sexual violence is a very big problem. It is probably the single, just to take the most extreme form, I think the spousal and partner homicide accounts for a huge proportion of all homicides in Western states. The vast majority of those, in turn, tend to be male perpetrators and female victims. And indeed, some feminists have argued, and I think accurately, that there is a parallel in modern liberal societies with this kind of crime and what we call honour crime in other sort of more patrimonial societies, where often the husband or the partner is not necessarily the perpetrator. And I think it would almost be correct to say that this is our honour crime. Although it is rare, some of the ideas that create motivations for this kind of crime are very much in our culture, or they're very much in the background of many motivations. So now my second reason, I think, for addressing this is that many on the sort of progressive left, self-identified, do talk an awful lot about violence against women and sexual minorities. However, their solutions often don't seem terribly adequate to this major problem. Whereas I think classical liberals don't talk nearly enough about this problem. And I think in doing so, we miss out on some of the great role that institutions that we support, such as free association and private property, the role that has played in improving this situation, albeit tentatively, and how it could improve the situation much more. And my third reason, which is of more theoretical interest, is that it helps to put Hayek in a sort of postmodern anti-positivist tradition. At least my solution tries to do that. And I think that helps to sort of cast Hayek in a new light, because I think in many ways he addresses postmodern problems. He addressed modern problems as well, but he addresses postmodern problems, and in many ways better than many people within postmodern theory, and those who are kind of more obviously pursuing that kind of approach. And so I think trying to sort of look at Hayek's anti-positivist and anti-realism is a very interesting way of kind of tackling these issues. So, what does the left do? What does the progressive left try to do to address these problems? They generally involve, if it's not just applying more money, more public money to particular agencies such as the police, who we know are not terribly good at dealing with these difficult issues in any case. Their approach tends to involve asserting particular rights for women and for sexual minorities. So it means identifying and categorizing people and then deciding what kind of rights need to be kind of made and how are these identities going to be recognized in the public sphere. And this can often sort of translate into quite symbolic kind of actions. So, a key one is, one that's sort of very recent, a sort of big victory, was this idea of getting more women on banknotes. So it was considered a big victory. And to be fair, there is probably some limited value in those kind of successes. So the idea that you're going to kind of show women in the public sphere more often, you're going to show them in positions of authority and in kind of high status positions, that will somehow alter the culture, alter the way that people will view women and view other minorities. And it's very similar in their kind of demands for political representation. So the idea is that we need kind of representatives from all different groups. We need more women in Parliament. We need more lesbians, gays, bisexuals, transgendered people on committees and things who are going to, and that is going to somehow sort of shift this situation in the long run. Now, a problem that the left often come into at this point is that these sort of rights often come into conflict. So, for example, one demand of some sort of activist transsexuals is that whichever sex they have decided to identify as, they want to be recognised as having that sex. Whereas to many feminists, the idea that a man could change gender and change their sex and then become a woman as a born woman can be remarkably offensive. And they feel that it's kind of breaking down what they see as an essential aspect of how they get represented. That there's a woman's experience that kind of runs all through their lives, and it's a different thing for transsexuals. Whereas for transsexuals, it's very important that they be put in the same category. So it's almost impossible not to misrecognize some of these categories, because part of having an identity is being able to select who gets to share in that identity. If there's a conflict over how that identity is going to work out, then it's very difficult to work out how you're going to reach a kind of progressive consensus on this. And of course, since this is happening in the public sphere and in a kind of democratic sphere, the only solution is a final decision. It has to be a kind of deliberated democratic decision, and the majority, hopefully you formed a consensus, but if not, it's going to be the majority. They're going to win in a particular policy issue or in a particular rights issue, and the others are just going to have to lump it, which leads to a lot of unhappiness, and it's the nature of a kind of zero-sum game that demands status where people demand particular statuses, and when they fail to get that, they feel that the whole field is kind of against them, that they are, that they have been diminished in some sense. Now, a lot of post-structuralist feminists have actually tackled this problem as well, and I think they now call it queer theory. One of the biggest figures in this is Judith Butler. And she sees this problem in terms of identifying essential categories in which individuals are all expected to fall into in some way. And she realizes that these categories vary. They're historically contingent. The idea of having lesbians and gays is a historically contingent notion. And of course, things, ideas such as homosexuality started off, in fact, as in medical discourses before they were taken on by people who chose to identify as homosexual. So she argues that it's actually quite problematic to rely for political action on these categories, which are bound to vary and in some cases are arbitrary, and they're certainly historically contingent. But she runs up against a problem. She has a little solution, which is to do with parodying existing sexuality. So, you know, she really likes sort of drag theatre and that sort of thing, and she thinks that helps to really try and break down these gender binaries and these sex binaries, and she thinks that there's some good stuff going on there, but it's somehow not very satisfying. It's certainly not satisfying for the feminists that she's addressing. And I think part of the reason for this is she lacks a concept which Hayek can offer. She's often looking for a concept that somehow falls between free will and determinism, which she sees the notions of gender and sexuality as being. So these are things that we both, on some level, decide how we're going to present and perform our sex and our gender, but at the same time, our choices are structured by power relations and by social circumstances. And this is actually very similar to Hayek's notion of a spontaneous order. So typical ones for Hayek are things like language, law, and money, as well as institutions like property. All we do here is include notions like sex and gender. And very importantly, Hayek makes a very useful distinction between concrete and abstract orders. Concrete orders, perhaps a typical one might be something like the human body itself. That's just, when he says concrete, he might mean something like real. An abstract order is something that tries to comprehend a concrete order in some way. So sex, gender, any number of other ideas that are kind of imposed on human bodies in order to kind of understand them. And they're always a model, a kind of an abstracted, simplified approach that allows people to comprehend items they come into in their everyday life in a particular just as a way of kind of dividing up the world and understanding what's going on. But at the same time, he understands that abstract orders are just are still just orders basically of our mind, and we could always approach concrete orders in different ways and divide them up in a different way. But of course, once these abstract orders exist, they then take on a kind of political element. They become part of what constitutes our discourse and the way that we see acceptable norms and behaviour. So once we understand that, we can understand, for example, why sexual transgressions, such as if you just see some gay men kissing, or a man in a dress, how these things, which are really quite ordinary, they're not imposing anything on anyone else, why they seem to get some people very het up, very angry, and potentially encourage them to engage in violence, depending on the context, and why it encourages these things to be banned by informal legislation. We've seen, homosexuality just got sort of rebanned in India this week. So once we understand this problem from Hayek's perspective, and I think it's quite similar, but offers a slightly richer approach than what some post-structuralists are saying, we might see that perhaps another solution to this problem of sex and gender violence is to say that we should not be trying to police certain norms in a particular way. Rather, we should actually be encouraging innovation and development in these areas. In other words, we should be encouraging people to feel that they don't have to enter into any particular gender norm or sex norm. And they're going to be able to come up with their own norms within their own voluntary associations and communities. And I think that the way that historically support for homosexual rights and support for other rights have developed illustrates this point. So, I mean, for example, gay rights in China really only emerged practically once you could have private property which was not doled out by a local communist official, which allowed, you know, gay and lesbian couples to just buy their own apartment, or at least rent their own apartment, and be able to kind of engage in an intimate setting without being judged by others. But it also allowed for more social settings, such as gay bars, which I understand there are now a number in China. And so, if we understand, and of course, this also applies to feminist approaches as well. So, a lot of feminists put a lot of emphasis on the need for safe spaces where men, as they define them, crucially, are pointedly excluded. They can be turned away at the door, and it's and some feminists find this to be, you know, very important for kind of developing an alternative way of living, at least an alternative way of discussing, or at least of working out their own norms, separate from what they see as an aggressive society. And so, in this sense, a lot of the institutions of voluntary association and private property present many of possible solutions which I think the progressive left have kind of left out. And so I suppose what I'd be suggesting is that we should be aiming for a series of overlapping private spheres, all with different kind of rules, different kind of orders, where new ways of being, experiments in living, as John Stuart Mill famously said, are possible, rather than a public sphere where there will always be winners and losers. And I suppose in terms of sort of concrete action, I guess I kind of come somewhat on Helen's side here, saying that there might well be a role for basic physical and social security to be provided by the state, and that should be universal, and they should be able to protect everyone, regardless of how eccentric they might be considered by the surrounding community. But when it comes to trying to enforce communal norms, the state should take a step back and encourage lots of a polycentric order to produce competing norms. So thanks very much.
Thank you. So what's very interesting about the paper to me is that it provides an account of, it might seem, of understanding the shall we say, the mix of, let's see what the term you hear here. So the mix of lifestyles, the composition of lifestyles are endogenous to the institutional regime in which those people operate. And that's a very economic way to explain something that's typically not discussed at length by economists. And I think that's very innovative and very interesting and potential for, pregnant with ideas. It would be interesting to understand a little bit more clearly about how different political regimes lead to more variety, more tolerance, and seeing, I guess, identifying the mechanisms through which that happens. And so you've identified private property, the right to have a gay bar, and to exclude people from that gay bar as being, parts of that richer story. So I think it's absolutely fascinating. I think you could even make it an empirical. I know that you're not maybe heavy on the empirical training, but you can co-author with Mark or someone else. But it'd be very interesting to kind of go out and test that a bit more, and I think that you might have some capability of doing so. I very much am a fan of understanding how polycentric governance regimes work. How do they come from? How do they work? How do they change over time? And importantly, what are the consequences? I mean, again, these sort of polycentric governance regimes can have very negative consequences. They can lead to lots of violence, lots of poverty. So what leads to a healthy set of alternative lifestyles, and how so? So Hayek's most well known perhaps for making the argument that when there's good institutions, markets communicate information, lead to economic development. And you're drawing on those types of arguments and conclusions to identify how a polycentric lifestyle regime may be beneficial. One area that I think you might want to tackle is understanding the feedback mechanism. So when Hayek looks at markets, he says there's property rights that allow people to engage in exchange, that elicit market prices, that communicate information about relative scarcities. In the lifestyles that you're examining, there's arguably property rights, depending on the institutional regime, which allow the endogenous emergence of the lifestyles. But there's not a lot of feedback, maybe, at least not in the paper, communicating how to coordinate people's life, to coordinate to solve the lifestyle scarcities that exist in these communities. So when you don't have profit and loss signals and you don't have market prices, what indication do we have that this is the optimal composition of lifestyles? So related to this is, I mean, I guess a common criticism about, there's two, you've taken an idea that's common in some places, you know, Nozick, for example, talking about anarchy is kind of a similar idea here. If exit costs are low enough, you're capable of finding your own utopia. And so I wonder what your thoughts are in the real world on how viable, how costly is an institutional regime like this. Related to that is a question about whether or not you're dodging the important issue, which is in a situation of coordinating people who have mutually beneficial exchanges available, socially or otherwise, but people don't enjoy seeing these alternative lifestyles. And to say that everyone should be happy because they can go to their own particular community and do that is to sort of sidestep the criticism that I don't like the idea that someone's doing that. And if it's literally, if it's visible, all the more so. So I don't know if you've adequately responded to that criticism, which is just that your preferences against these things are wrong, and so we will discount them. I wonder, for your argument to be true, that the composition of lifestyles in a community are endogenous to institutions, if that requires a certain view about sexuality, whether it's innate, whether it's chosen, whether it's a preference. And if you don't have a clear answer on that, that it's relatively flexible, then it wouldn't seem to be true, I guess, what you're arguing, except to the extent that it relates to violence, in which case the lifestyle choices are not what you're trying to understand, but subsequent violence. So maybe I'll just make two other quick points. One is that you identify the role of language, law, and network goods, and how these are somewhat effective, I guess, in the spontaneous order context. These are network goods, right? These are goods where there's an interaction effect with how much you desire something relative to how many other people have it. And I wonder if the lifestyles and activities that you've described have much less of a network effect. I suppose some of the lifestyles, the network would be the end goal. But maybe think a bit more about how the nature of what these people are seeking differs from situations. Your particular enjoyment in living a lifestyle or engaging in certain activities may not depend on what other people are doing at all. And does that undermine the analogy that you're making? Finally, I guess I'd like to know how far you would push this system. Can we have a market for babies in some of these worlds? Is there a lifestyle for baby farmers that would be acceptable? Fill in a variety of other examples of questionably undesirable activities. And what's the stopping argument if there is one? So how much should we allow violence or discrimination within groups, and on what grounds would you limit that, since it seems to be that the exit and the choice is what is the feature that drives your analysis. So thank you very much. Very interesting.
Well, thank you to the Legatum Institute for having me out, to Edo for organizing. Very excited to be here and to get to talk with everyone. I decided before I started teaching my course this semester that I was going to write this essay on Hayek and intellectual property rights, and just got lucky enough to be teaching out of Fatal Conceit this semester and found a passage that I had completely forgotten where he mentioned it, so it worked out well. I chose IP because it is a sort of lively debate issue both among classical liberal scholars and among economists. So I think if you were to go outside of those two camps, you would see a lot more uniformity of opinion in sort of clustering. But both economists argue among themselves about intellectual property all the time, and as do classical liberals. I want to, obviously, since we're talking in a Hayekian vein, want to set aside the sort of natural rights arguments and instead talk about the effects of intellectual property rights on innovation, which is the dominant vehicle by which this debate gets carried. So the two sides are sort of well known to each other, that intellectual property rights, on the one hand, can create incentives for innovation by allowing people to reap rewards on an idea that is otherwise, non-scarce and easy to copy. Right? That's by far the most common defense of intellectual property rights. So the classic study in economics would be Petra Moser's work on 19th century science fairs, essentially these exhibits and stuff, and which countries had more or less intellectual property protection. The counter argument that sort of comes out of more advanced endogenous growth theory, by advanced I just mean temporally advanced, comes later in time, is the idea of cumulative innovation, that we get innovations by drawing on previous innovations, and so to the extent that we lock down previous innovations, we're going to stop or slow down that iterative process, right? So this is essentially an argument about I think both of those are plausible stories, and this is essentially an argument about two countervailing forces that are pushing against each other, and obviously it's entirely counterfactual in terms of the empirics, which makes it incredibly hairy to deal with, right? Because we don't know how many things would have been invented under a different regime, under exactly the same circumstances, because innovation is notoriously difficult to deal with in this way. So I sort of just wanted to ask, what can Hayek add to this debate as it's gone on, all right? And really have two things that I think are important. And the second one I think is far more important than the first, but just going in order. The first most obvious connection with Hayek and this debate about intellectual property is his sense of competition as a discovery procedure. So on sort of all sides of the debate in the dominant economics literature, the innovation is largely driven by the same sort of input-output model that we would use to explain sort of turning cucumbers into pickles, right? Like you have inputs, you have outputs, and there's just a sort of material relationship. So R&D spending goes in one side of the firm, and then innovations come out the other side of the firm, right? And that's the way that the process of innovation is understood. I think that obviously Hayek's sense of competition and discovery procedure is in some ways radically different from that. I don't want to stress it too much because I'm not sure that the implications are overly different than the input-output model in this case. But certainly the sense of a sort of embedded or ecological rationality, to use Vernon Smith's term, that goes along with Hayek, where entrepreneurs are experimenting and they're drawing on the knowledge of other entrepreneurs and they're embedded in these networks and markets and stuff. I think that's a very different sort of model of how we get innovation than is the R&D goes into the black box and we get innovations out the other side. So Hayek's got this great passage in, I believe, chapter 10 of Law, Legislation, and Liberty, where he talks about the cast of the entrepreneurial mind, that the mind will take on a different character according to which the task it is set and in the environment in which it's situated. And that's the sort of thing I have in mind here. And I think that if you take that seriously theoretically, I think that lends weight to the cumulative innovation side of the argument, right? Just in terms of where would he chime in there? I think he would say, yeah, since the entrepreneur is embedded in this market process and he's relying on the knowledge of others to even get to the point where he can innovate, I think that lends weight to the cumulative side. And so, not being an econometrician myself, I didn't do anything with this, but I think that, insofar as our empirical estimates themselves, since they're counterfactual, rely on these standard sorts of input-output models, it's worth thinking about where they might be biased in terms of underestimating the cumulative nature of innovation in that sense. More importantly, entrepreneurship is embedded in the institutional context. So I really love this classic James Buchanan article, Rent-Seeking versus Profit-Seeking, where he points out that the attempt to gain profits by enabling people to pursue their goals at lower cost is, from the individual perspective, isomorphic to the attempt to gain profits by just grabbing more resources. And the only thing that makes a difference is the institutional context within which that takes place. All right, and I think that we have sort of clear evidence that this is happening, that the institutional environment that surrounds intellectual property has enabled rent-seeking rather than profit-seeking. The most high-profile form of this is this sense of patent trolling that's gotten a lot of play in the past few years. So what I think one of the best scholars on this, Colleen Chen, calls them patent asserting entities. This is slightly different than the definition other people use. Initiated 62% of patent legislation in 2012. These are entities that don't actually, firms that don't actually produce anything. All they do is accumulate patents and then pursue legal action in the hope that most of the time that the other firm, instead of trying to fight them in court, will just pay the settlement. And so they make their revenue stream entirely in terms of not generating anything, it's not lowering costs for anybody, but just in terms of grabbing the resources. I just saw a great ruling a couple days ago that online yoga is apparently the newest sphere in which this is taking place, that someone patented the camera angle from which they tape yoga and put the videos up online, and then they started sending cease and desist letters to other things. So the original application of just filming yoga from the back of the classroom was too vague even for the US Patent Office. But then it got approved when they added the qualifier that from about 3 feet high will film, and that made it okay, and so now they've got all these cease and desist orders going through. And all of this is driven by a particular US Federal Circuit Court ruling that allowed people to patent general ideas rather than, say, specific implementations. So like swipe to turn on your phone is patented rather than the code itself that enables swipe to turn on to take place. So we've had a remarkable strengthening of intellectual property law in the past 30 or 40 years with these sorts of, from a Buchanan Hayek perspective, predictable results. The second connection I want to draw, I think this is the far more interesting and more important one, is the function and evolution of property rights in Hayek. And this is when Hayek actually talks about intellectual property rights, this is the context in which the discussion appears. So it's in chapter 2 of The Fatal Conceit, when he's talking about the historical evolution of property rights, how they emerge, and the sorts of problems that they tend to solve. So I think, in The Fatal Conceit, Hayek offers a sort of twin process of social evolution. There's the play within the rules, as David mentioned, and then there's also the development of the rules themselves. Bruce Benson, who follows up on a lot of Hayek's work in law and economics, I think aptly characterizes this as he's got a great article called "It Takes Two Invisible Hands to Make a Market." Right? There's the invisible hand that generates the rules of the game, and there's the invisible hand of the play within the rules of the game. All right, and that for Hayek, social evolution proceeds at a sort of in a healthy direction as long as these twin processes are interacting, and as long as the state doesn't curtail the two of them in order to serve particular interests. So he gives the example of like the Roman Republic is one that curtailed the more bottom-up process of Roman law in order to start conferring benefits on particular groups, as leading to the decline in that civilization. Right? Now the thing about the invisible hand of the development of the law, rather than the invisible hand within the market process, is that it works well when it's predicated on individuals signing contracts with each other or coming into actual conflicts with each other. So all the historical cases that we have about the spontaneous evolution of rules are driven by sort of end users, practitioners of whatever social sphere, whether we're talking about merchants in the medieval world or like Eleanor Ostrom's people using common pool resources and stuff. They get into actual conflicts with each other, and then they try out different ways of settling the conflicts because they don't want to spend their whole time fighting, because they're the actual practitioners of the activity in question. They're the people sort of engaged on the ground. When you have, and then the good solutions get copied, and gradually we get a codification of abstract rules as opposed to specific contracts, all right, and specific rulings over time. When you have that, the philosopher John Hasmus has this great description of rights are solved problems. That's the outcome of that sort of a process, where we start off with simple contracts, simple agreements, or simple resolutions to particular disputes, and we end up with these abstract categories of rights that solve persistent problems in particular social contexts. All right? They allow us to sort of get along with each other. I think Hayek's attitude, and Hayek expresses doubts about intellectual property, can best be summed up by the idea that statutory law is solutions in search of problems. So rather than emerging out of the actual conflicts of the people involved in a given practice, someone comes in and says, hey, here's a problem that you didn't know you had. Let me please solve it for you by passing this law. and you end up with a very different quality of law there, right? So I just make a couple sort of points drawing on this. One is that I don't distinguish in the paper between like patents and copyrights, and people like to draw out these distinctions between different types of intellectual property. To me, I didn't make that distinction because that's sort of the point. We don't know what the optimal mix of different types of intellectual property is. So I'm not trying to make an argument that the optimal amount of intellectual property protection is 0. I just think that the current regime is incredibly dysfunctional precisely because we've never gone through the process with intellectual property rights of actually adjudicating these disputes, not with anything like the current technologies that we've got on the table, all right? Another point is that the rules should evolve over time. They should move with the technology, right? What it means to have the right of privacy is very different in a world where you can tap someone's internet connection and find out what they're doing than it does in a world before the internet exists, right? So the manifestation of the concrete decision rights needs to be different as technology changes. So we've got this very odd situation in the modern world in which the sphere in which ideas are moving the fastest, in just sheer intellectual content creation, is the sphere in which we've adopted the most top-down Leviathan approach to making the rules. The most static and least nimble version of rulemaking has been applied to the most nimble, most entrepreneurial sector of the economy, all right? So I think you can see, sort of what I would consider suggestive evidence for this is that precisely in the sphere where the rules are least enforceable that you get the most innovation in contracting regarding intellectual content. So where IP law is least enforceable is in something like movies, music, things that lots of people want to use where it's very difficult to sort of put the toothpaste back in the bottle once it's out there. And yet that's exactly where we see the most innovative forms of contracting regarding intellectual property. So like Spotify, Pandora, Netflix, right? At a certain point, people manage to bundle together these contracts that provide people with the same services that they could pirate, but at lower cost than actually pirating. So rather than having to spend hours online looking for the particular, a good copy of whatever movie you want, right? You just hit the button and then you stream it and it's good to go. So I think the fact that we have that sort of innovation is at least suggestive. But the real gains from sort of modern information technology and stuff will only come when we have that sort of innovative contracting more upstream in the process, what Hayek would call a higher order of production, right? Further up in the capital structure. And it's, those more basic forms of intellectual property precisely where we don't have this sort of innovative contracting going on and leading us toward those things. So Hayek's got many passages where he talks about how we can tweak the rules using the tools of social science, right? He's not a nihilist. He does it about reform, right? He thinks that we can step in and to some extent understand the way the rules work and tweak them a little bit. I think that's true, but I think that's only true if we're starting from a remotely sensible position to begin with and correcting things on the margin. And I don't think we have anything like a remotely sensible starting point with intellectual property law at this stage. So the paper's titled Abolition as a Positive Program precisely because there needs to be this sort of experimentation before we can even have a sensible discussion about tweaking this or that form of intellectual property. I think this is a far more fundamental issue with this. So thank you for your time.
Okay, so to my reading, Nick's paper is one that looks at how institutions lead to a particular set of outcomes within that set of rules. And Adams is one that says, let's see if we can explain how the rules change, how those changes affect the second game. So there's institutional level outcomes and analysis, and then within those institutions we can analyze how they are. And Adams, the innovative aspect of Adams' paper is to say, look, let's try to get some innovation not within the rules of the game, but over the rules of the game. And that's something that's very interesting that I'm not particularly aware of in the IP literature. So I guess there's maybe a few short points. So I very much like it, and I always say nice things about Adam's paper, and I always believe them. I'll focus on just the complaints today. One is that I think that you should address, or at least offer a few comments on the similarities between things that are covered under intellectual property law within the set of institutions and the innovation that takes place over the rules. The idea of a new form of innovation, a new form of institutions would seem to suffer from the very same problem that making more music or shows makes. So is it how are those problems going to be solved? Are they going to be solved in the same way? Are they going to fail because there's not a third level institution that enforces IP over institutions that enforce actual IP laws? Does it matter if they're different? And how would we predict the outcome to change as a result? Related to that, I was very interested in thinking about this, the Spotify, the Netflix. If I understand the argument correctly, the claim is that where enforcing IP is most difficult is where you see the most innovation over rules to try to control that. Very, very, very clever observation. And I'd like to push you to document that more thoroughly. Is Netflix successful because they've changed the rules of how they offer these services, or is the platform of Netflix itself intellectual property? So is it the current IP practices that allow this minor change on the margin? And if that's driving it, then that would tend to discount your conclusion to some extent. To play devil's advocate, I also want to push back against the idea that statute-created laws are much more likely to not correspond to the needs that practitioners have. So if I'm a reader of Dick Wagner and I say, you know what, the government is almost best understood as a spontaneous order. So the outcomes that the government creates, the statute that it creates is, as on par with market outcomes in the spontaneous order that exists in Benson's work. So what's the distinction? Is it that governments have a greater threat of coercion than non-government actors? Well, I don't typically buy that. I think violence is an excellent resource allocation mechanism, and there's an optimal amount of violence in the creation of institutions and enforcement of the rules within them. So what is it that should make us discount? And it very well may be the interaction of practitioners, but we've got a scaling up problem. It's a common complaint. If it's not just practitioners who know each other and frequently interact, how are these rules going to work? How are they going to work in Nick's world, where there is a great diversity of people who have very different preferences? So what's the scaling up issues? And I think that there's something that's unsettling to me about the practitioner involvement issue, to the extent that in the paper you discuss how IP lawyers are the narrow interest to which these institutions are funneling the resources. And I agree that they benefit from it and that they are a narrow interest that does so, but that doesn't suggest or imply that the institutions or the benefits that are available are narrowly provided. So just because this narrow group gets them doesn't mean that there's not substantial benefits to all the artists out there that exists. Justin Bieber, he benefits a great deal, and that's not necessarily narrowly interested in the redistribution way that you're describing. So I think it's a promising project that's innovative to the extent that I haven't seen people talk about how you can seek out innovation over the rules to improve the outputs that we desire from the imposition of IP laws. So, thanks.